Please be seated. The first service of Easter is on Saturday night. It's called the Easter Vigil. And the Easter Vigil begins with the lighting of the Paschal candle. The church is often dark, and we process down the aisle of the church with the lights out. And the only light in the building is the Paschal candle. And 3 times the deacon stops and chants, "The light of Christ." And 3 times the people chant back, "Thanks be to God." And when we get up to the front, the deacon puts the candle into the stand and then begins to chant what's called the Exsultet. And the service continues after that with 7 or 8 lessons that recite salvation history. Last night we read 3 of those. The first one is the story of creation, to remind us that God made this. We didn't. God made this, and all that is in it. The second story last night was the story of the deliverance of the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt and the parting of the Red Sea. And it is an utterly miraculous event, and now archaeologists say they have found some really interesting evidence on the shores of the Gulf of Aqaba. Is that where the sea was parted and the Hebrews walked through? I don't know. I don't know, but I'm going to look forward to reading more articles. And then the third story we heard last night was about the dry bones and how God made a whole valley of bones live. And what it reminds us is that life comes from God. We still haven't figured out how to give life to anything. Now, if you have a heart attack and your heart stops, the doctors can put those paddles on your chest and restart. We know how to do that. But we don't know how to give you life after it's gone. We don't know how to do that. And the story of Jesus coming back from the dead is all part of that, that Jesus died and rose again. It's a miracle that just is so difficult to understand and so difficult to explain. And one day a father was explaining to his 5-year-old son about how Jesus died and then on the 3rd day rose from the dead. And he said to his son, "That's what we believe. That's how we know Jesus is the Son of God, because he came back from the dead just like he said he would." And the little boy looked up at his father and said, "You mean just like Elvis?" Not quite. Not quite. Now remember, Elvis in life was a tremendous entertainer. He had a really remarkable voice, but he also he did not die well. His caretakers were too generous with him. He died of overindulgence. He did not die well at all. He died in his early 40s. But Jesus, on the other hand, dies a horrible death, but he dies well. He dies with a purpose. And his story, this story of the resurrection, is one that we need to continue to tell because it helps people. It helps us live. And all of us in the church are going to have to continue working hard to tell this story to a world that increasingly doesn't want to hear it. And now, in St. John's Gospel that Jeremy just read to us, Mary Magdalene comes first to the tomb. It says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Now, remember, in the Middle East, 2,000 years ago, when you were put in a tomb, a stone was rolled in front. They would dig a shallow trench. It might be this long. It might be 3 feet deep. But a big stone, about 6 feet high, would be rolled into that shallow trench, and it would fall. And so there's no way one person could move it. It would take a number of people to move that stone. So first you have to figure out how the stone was moved. And so she finds the stone moved, and there's no body in the tomb. So she goes and tells Simon Peter and the disciple, the other disciple, the one that Jesus loved, and she said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him. Now it's fascinating that Mary Magdalene is the one to make this discovery, to be the first witness. Now we don't actually know a whole lot about Mary Magdalene, but she had a bad reputation. She had a really bad reputation, especially in the Western church, because in the Western church, it's generally thought she was a prostitute before she met Jesus. But there's really very little scriptural evidence of this. Indeed, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they insist that Mary Magdalene was a virtuous woman all her life. But Jesus has a different view of Mary than any of us in the West. Jesus has got a different approach to women than anybody else in his time. Outside the village of Sychar, he meets a woman at a well. And he confesses to this woman who has had 5 husbands and who is living with a man she is not married to. She is a notorious woman. She's at the well alone because the other women will not associate with her. And to her, Jesus confesses that he is the Messiah. Indeed, she's the first person in this gospel that he will confess this to. Again and again, we see this Jesus honoring women and giving them equal footing with men. Now remember, in Jewish society 2,000 years ago, a woman had her testimony had no weight in court. None at all. The testimony of her 5-year-old son would bear more weight than hers. But Jesus doesn't look at women the way the rest of his society does. And so it's no surprise that his empty tomb is first discovered by a woman. And this woman is Mary Magdalene. And throughout the gospel, she has been tremendously loyal to Jesus. And on Good Friday, she will stand at the foot of the cross with Mary, his mother, and all the other disciples have run away. Now, before dawn on the 3rd day, it's Mary Magdalene who rises to anoint his body. She makes her way to the tomb and finds it empty. So she runs to find Peter, who runs back to the tomb with St. John, and they confirm what Mary has reported. Peter and John leave to go home, but Mary remains there in the garden by the tomb, overwhelmed by events. She has tears running down her face. And when she looks in the tomb again, she sees 2 angels who ask, "Why are you crying?" And then she hears another voice who says the same thing. "Woman, why are you crying?" It's the sort of question that Jesus often asked. He was a man full of compassion. And in her confusion, Mary thinks he's the gardener. She says, "Sir, if you carried him away, tell me where you put him and I will go get him." And then with one word, reality shifts. Everything changes.